Scary telling.
I was always close to my little sister, Lily. We were inseparable growing up, always playing together and exploring the world around us. But when Lily disappeared, everything changed. It happened on a warm summer day when we were out in the woods behind our house. We were playing hide and seek, and I remember counting to 10 and then searching for her. But she was nowhere to be found. I called out her name, but there was no response. We searched the woods for hours, calling out her name and looking under every bush and tree, but she was nowhere to be found. We went back home and told our parents, who called the police. They searched the woods, but there was no sign of Lily. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Our family was torn apart by Lily's disappearance. My parents were consumed by grief, and I was left to pick up the pieces. I tried to stay strong for them, but it was hard. I missed my sister so much. And then, one night, I woke up to the sound of Lily's voice calling out to me. I sat up in bed, confused and disoriented. It was dark in my room, and I couldn't see anything. But then I heard her voice again. "Help me," she said. "Mommy killed me." I sat there in shock, unsure of what to do. I knew I had to tell my parents, but I was afraid they wouldn't believe me. Lily's voice was so real, so vivid. But it was also so unsettling. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened. They looked at me with a mix of sadness and disbelief. They didn't want to believe that Lily was gone, let alone that something had happened to her. But things only got worse from there. My parents started fighting more, and they became distant from me. They would spend hours locked in their bedroom, arguing and crying. I didn't know what to do. And then, one day, I overheard my mother talking on the phone. She was talking to someone about Lily, but her voice was hushed and urgent. I listened in, trying to hear what she was saying. "She's gone," my mother said. "We have to move on. We can't keep pretending she's still here." My heart sank. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My mother had killed my sister, and she was trying to cover it up. But how could I prove it? I started digging through my mother's things, looking for any clues. I found a locked box under her bed, and I managed to pry it open. Inside, I found a stack of papers and photos, all detailing my mother's mental illness and her struggles with anger and violence. And then I found a photo of Lily lying motionless on the ground. Her eyes were closed, and her body was covered in bruises. I knew then that my mother had killed her. But when I confronted my mother, she denied everything. She told me that I didn't have a sister, that I was making it all up. I was trapped, with no way to prove what had happened. Years went by, and I moved away from my family. I couldn't bear to be near them, knowing what my mother had done. But I could never forget Lily's voice, calling out to me from the other side. It haunted me, reminding me of what I had lost. And then, one night, I heard Lily's voice again. But this time, it was different. This time, she was singing a lullaby. It was a lullaby our mother used to sing to us when we were little, but it was different somehow. It was slower, more mournful. I followed the sound of the singing, and it led me to an old, abandoned house on the edge of town. The house was dark and foreboding, and I hesitated before entering. Inside, the house was silent. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. But then I heard the singing again, faintly, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. I followed the sound down a dark hallway and into a room at the end. The room was empty, except for a single chair in the center. And in the chair, I saw my sister. She was older now, but it was definitely her. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. "Help me," she said again. "Mommy killed me." I stepped forward, wanting to embrace her, but she disappeared before I could reach her. And then I heard my mother's voice, coming from behind me. "I told you, you don't have a sister," she said, and I turned to face her. But she wasn't alone. Behind her stood Lily, her body bruised and battered, but her eyes alive with a fierce determination. "Mommy did this to me," she said. "But now, I'm going to make her pay." And with that, she vanished into thin air, leaving me alone with my mother. I never saw Lily again, but I knew she was at peace. And as for my mother, she was never the same. She was haunted by Lily's voice, just as I was. But now, she had to live with the knowledge of what she had done and the consequences that came with it. I never intended for it to go this far. It started as a harmless game of make-believe with my little brother, pretending to be each other and fooling our parents. But as the days went by, I found myself getting more and more lost in the role. Until one day, I couldn't tell where my brother ended and I began. It wasn't long before my parents started to notice something was off. They would call me by my name, but I would answer with my brother's. They would ask me to do something, but I would do what my brother would do. And worst of all, I started to believe that I was him. That's when I came up with the idea to take it to the next level. I found a stapler in my dad's office and decided to attach a picture of my brother's face to mine, just for fun. But it wasn't enough. As I looked in the mirror, I realized that I wanted to be him. To know what it was like to be so carefree and innocent. And so, I peeled off the picture and began to staple my brother's actual face to mine. My mother screamed, horrified at what she saw. But I was beyond caring. I wanted to be my brother, and the pain was worth it. At first, it was just a few staples holding his face to mine, but I couldn't stop. I kept going until his entire face was attached to mine, and I looked like a grotesque version of him. The pain was unbearable, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to be my brother. But then, something strange started to happen. I would look in the mirror and see his face staring back at me, but it wasn't just a reflection. It was like he was really there, watching me. And then, one night, he spoke to me. "Let me go," he whispered. "You're hurting me." I was terrified. My brother was dead. There was no way he could be talking to me. But the voice persisted, growing louder and more insistent. "Let me go," it said. "You don't want to be me. You don't know what I went through." I didn't know what to do. Was I going crazy? Was my guilt and grief over my brother's death finally catching up to me? And then, something even more terrifying happened. My brother's face started to move on its own, like it had a life of its own. It would smile at me when I was sad, frown at me when I was happy. It was like he was controlling me, using me to live out the life he never had. I tried to take off his face, to free myself from his control, but it was no use. The staples were too strong, and my brother's face was now a permanent part of mine. I was trapped, living a life that wasn't mine. And every day, my brother's face would taunt me, reminding me of what I had done. I tried to tell my parents, to beg for their help, but they just thought I was crazy. They didn't believe that my brother was speaking to me through his face. And so, I was left alone with my guilt and my brother's face, living a life that wasn't mine. I don't know what will happen to me, but I know that I'll never be able to escape my brother's shadow or the pain of what I did to him. Ever since I was a kid, I've always loved animals. I grew up with a menagerie of pets, from cats and dogs to birds and fish. But no matter where I've lived, I've always had to say goodbye to them eventually. And every time I did, I made sure they had a proper burial in the backyard. At first, it was just a little plot of land behind our old house, a place where I could go to remember my furry friends. But over the years, it grew into something much larger. Every time we moved, I would carefully dig up the remains of my pets and bring them with me to our new home. And every time, I would bury them in the backyard once again. It became a ritual, a way for me to cope with the loss of my animal companions. But as I got older, I started to notice something strange. No matter where I lived, the backyard always seemed to have the same layout. The same trees, the same bushes, the same little hill where I buried my pets. It was like they were following me, like they were somehow connected to me no matter where I went. And then, one day, I found out why. I was out in the backyard, tending to the garden, when I heard a strange noise. It was a scratching sound, coming from beneath the ground. At first, I thought it was just a tree root, but then I noticed something moving in the soil. I reached down and started to dig, my hands clawing through the dirt. And that's when I saw it, the unmistakable shape of a cat's skull. I kept digging, uncovering more and more bones. There were cats, dogs, birds, fish, and even a hamster. They were all there, buried in a neat little row, just like they had been in my old backyard. I couldn't believe it. How had they followed me all this way? And why were they all buried in exactly the same spot? As I stood there, staring at the pet cemetery in shock, I heard a voice behind me. "Hello, friend." I turned around to see a strange old woman standing there, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "I see you found my little gift," she said with a grin. I was confused. "What gift? Who are you?" She cackled, her laugh echoing through the trees. "Why, I'm the Witch of the Woods, of course. And I've been watching you for a long time, my dear." I was scared now, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want from me?" She just smiled, her eyes glittering with malice. "Oh, nothing much. Just your soul." And with that, she vanished into thin air, leaving me alone with the pet cemetery and a sense of creeping dread. I tried to move away, to forget about the bones in my backyard, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see their empty sockets staring back at me. I could hear their ghostly meows and barks, their little claws scratching at the ground. And then, one night, something happened that I'll never forget. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard a soft thumping sound outside my window. I got up to investigate, my heart racing in my chest. And that's when I saw it, the ghostly shape of my old dog, wagging its tail and looking up at me with sad, pleading eyes. I screamed and ran back to bed, pulling the covers up over my head. But I knew it was no use. The pet cemetery had come alive, and there was no escape. From that night on, I was haunted by the ghosts of my pets. I would hear them scratching at the door, meowing and barking in the night. I could feel their cold breath on my face, their phantom fur brushing against my skin. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that I was just imagining things. But deep down, I knew the truth. The Witch of the Woods had cursed me, and there was no going back. I spent years living in that house, tormented by the spirits of my beloved pets. I tried everything to make them go away, exorcisms, blessings, even moving to a different room, but nothing worked. They were always there, always watching, always waiting. And then, one day, I woke up to find that the pet cemetery was gone. The ground was smooth and bare, with no sign that anything had ever been buried there. I felt a sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. But at the same time, I felt a deep sadness, like I had lost a part of myself. Years went by, and I eventually moved away from that house. I never saw the Witch of the Woods again, and I never went back to that cursed pet cemetery. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is howling and the moon is full, I swear I can still hear the ghostly meows and barks of my long-dead pets calling out to me from beyond the grave. I thought the hardest part of losing my daughter was saying goodbye at her funeral, but that was just the beginning of my nightmare. Every night since her passing, I hear her crying and screaming, her voice echoing through the halls of our home. It's like she's still with us, trapped between this world and the next. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the sound of her wails became more and more real every night, keeping me awake and on edge. I couldn't take it anymore, so I decided to do the only thing that made sense to me, visit her grave and ask her to stop. The cemetery was quiet at night, the only sounds coming from the leaves rustling in the breeze. I found my way to her plot, the fresh flowers I brought with me contrasting with the cold, hard stone. I knelt down and started to talk to her, hoping that she could hear me. "Sweetheart, I miss you so much," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Please, stop crying. It's breaking my heart." But the only response was the sound of my own sobs echoing through the graveyard. I tried to calm myself, to remember that she was gone and there was nothing I could do to bring her back. But as I stood up to leave, I heard something that made me freeze in place. It was her laugh. It was the same laugh I remembered from when she was alive, the one that would make me smile no matter how bad my day was. It was coming from behind me, from her grave. I turned around slowly, my heart racing in my chest. And that's when I saw her, my daughter, standing beside her headstone, her face pale and her eyes dark. "Mama," she said, her voice a whisper. "Why did you leave me?" I stumbled backwards, my mind unable to comprehend what was happening. "I didn't leave you, honey. You passed away." But she just kept staring at me, her eyes boring into mine. "Why did you bury me here, in this cold, dark place? Why didn't you let me come home with you?" I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "We wanted to give you a proper burial, sweetie. We thought this was what you would have wanted." She shook her head, her hair whipping around her face. "I hate it here. It's so lonely, and I'm so scared." And then she started to cry, the same heart-wrenching sobs that I heard every night in our home. I tried to comfort her, to hold her close, but my arms passed right through her body. "Mama, please take me home with you. I can't stay here anymore." I didn't know what to do. Was this really my daughter, or was it some kind of twisted nightmare? But as I looked into her eyes, I knew that it was her. And I knew that I had to try to help her. I took her hand and led her out of the cemetery, back to our home. I could still hear her cries and sobs, but they were softer now, more like a whisper. When we got inside, I sat her down on the couch and tried to make her comfortable. "Sweetie, I don't know how to help you. I don't know how to make you stop crying." And then something strange happened. Her body started to fade away, becoming more and more translucent until she was almost invisible. "Mama, it's okay," she said, her voice barely audible. "I love you. But I have to go now." And then, just like that, she was gone. I was left alone in the quiet of our home, with only the memory of her ghostly presence to keep me company. I didn't know what to do or where to turn. I had thought that visiting her grave would bring me some kind of closure, but instead, it had opened up a whole new world of horror. The next night, the crying and screaming started up again, even louder than before. I knew that I couldn't keep living like this, listening to the ghostly cries of my daughter every night. So I made a decision. I went back to the cemetery, armed with a shovel and a determination to bring my daughter back home with me, one way or another. I dug and dug until I reached her coffin, my hands shaking with fear and exhaustion. But when I opened it up, I found nothing inside. No body, no bones, no trace of my daughter's remains. I was overcome with a sense of dread, a feeling that I was being watched. And then I saw them, the ghosts of other children, their bodies twisted and broken, their eyes staring at me with a malevolent glee. I realized then that I had been tricked, that my daughter's ghost had lured me to the cemetery to become one of them, to join their spectral ranks forever. But I refused. I ran as fast as I could, back to my home, back to the safety of the living. But even though I'm back in the world of the living, I can still hear the cries of the ghosts, the ones who want to pull me back into their realm. I know that I'll never be truly safe, that the horror of my daughter's death will follow me wherever I go. And I can only hope that someday, somehow, I'll be able to find a way to make peace with the ghosts that haunt me. My wife and I had always been concerned about our son's hair. Every time we tried to cut it, he would scream and cry as if we were hurting him. We had tried everything to make it easier for him, from distracting him with toys to using special scissors, but nothing seemed to work. Desperate for answers, we finally decided to take him to a psychiatrist. We told her about our son's reaction to haircuts, hoping that she could offer some guidance or insight. After several tests and consultations with other doctors, we were referred to a genetic specialist. It was there that we learned the horrifying truth about our son's hair. According to the specialist, our son had a unique condition in which there were live nerve endings in his hair. This meant that every time we cut his hair, he was experiencing a level of pain that was far beyond anything we could have imagined. I felt sick with guilt and shame as the specialist explained the condition to us. How could I have been so blind to my son's suffering? How could I have let him endure such pain without even realizing it? But as the days passed, my guilt turned to something much darker. It started with small things, like feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up whenever I walked past a hair salon, or seeing a stranger with long hair and feeling a sense of revulsion. Soon, it escalated into something much worse. I began to have vivid nightmares about my son's hair coming to life, writhing and squirming like a nest of snakes. I would wake up sweating and shaking, convinced that there was something malevolent lurking in my son's hair. My wife tried to reassure me that it was just my imagination, that our son was just like any other child with a unique condition. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more sinister at play. It wasn't until one night, when I was alone with my son and he fell asleep with his hair splayed out across the pillow, that I finally saw the truth. His hair was moving. Not just twitching or blowing in the breeze, but actively wriggling and squirming like a living creature. I was frozen in terror, unable to move or even breathe as I watched my son's hair writhe and twist, as if it was trying to break free from his scalp. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. My son's hair lay still and motionless, as if nothing had happened. I knew then that I had to do something. I couldn't let my son suffer any longer, couldn't let him live with this bizarre and horrifying condition. But I also knew that there was no easy solution. In the end, we opted for surgery. It was risky and expensive, but it was our only hope of giving our son a normal life. And thankfully, it worked. After the surgery, our son no longer screamed when we cut his hair. He no longer had to live with the constant pain and discomfort that had plagued him for so long. But even now, years later, I still can't shake the memory of my son's living hair. I still feel a sense of unease whenever I think about it, a lingering fear that there might be something out there in the world that is just as unnatural and terrifying as what we went through.